patriotism, faith, national unity, education, fiscal responsibility, civility, the values that define America. Fascinating stories and talks from America-loving patriots dedicated to preserving freedom, opportunity, and justice. Welcome to the Friends and Fellow Citizens podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 119 of Friends and Fellow Citizens. I'm your host, Sherman Tylowski. Thank you all so much for joining me for this week's Sacred Honor Series episode. First of all, once again, I want to thank especially our Patreon supporters. They have been supporting this show for all these several months and now almost a few years. And I am just very, very grateful for their support. And I also want to thank the subscribers too. By the way, if this is your first time listening to this show, or if you have any friends or family who might be interested, and if you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe to Friends and Fellow Citizens so you get notifications when new episodes come out. Once again, we put out episodes on the first 2 Mondays of each month, the first being an interview, the second being a solo episode like this one. So be sure to check out more of our information on our website at georgewashingtoninstitute.org. Once again, we're really into that transition period of bringing in the podcast and now into with the George Washington Institute and really the podcast as a product of the George Washington Institute. So this episode we'll be switching colonies again. We were on New York for some time, and now we are heading just a little bit south to the colony of New Jersey. And our first signer from this colony is Richard Stockton. Stockton was born in 1730. He was a very well-educated man, very well-connected politically, quite wealthy for him and his family. They had a home called Morven, which was actually the former governor's mansion from the 1950s to the 1980s. And he grew up really just as an aspiring judge, and he was very interested in the law. He trained himself and really learned a lot about the law and started his own law practice in the 1750s. He would have likely been known to be one of the best judges in the colonies if the colonies were to stay in Britain. But obviously, nothing is normal whatsoever when it comes to the history of the American Revolution, so his career trajectory certainly did not go the way he planned to. And really, I'm sure when it comes to how he probably felt about his career, you'll see later on in the episode of why this was harder than perhaps some other founders and signers we've covered. The signers really, just generally speaking, what is interesting about this series is that as we look into every single signer, every single one of them has had commonalities. You know, they're very politically connected and many times very wealthy, but the ways in which they went about their lives and the misfortunes and the fortunes that occurred to these signers vary a lot. And this episode will be a lot about some of the challenges that signers like Richard Stockton really encountered, and gives a different light into what the British were really like. It wasn't just two powers, one obviously being a great power, others a group of colonies, fighting over authority and of territorial gains, but it was much more than that. I think it really comes down to how these two sides really went about their strategies of trying to defeat the other side. And so Stockton is very much connected, and once again, with the political elite in the UK, and he actually does pretty well in knowing a lot of these people in Westminster. In fact, he frequented Westminster Hall, which is that very historic building in London where the Houses of Parliament are. And Westminster Hall, by the way, is several hundred years old. I mean, that's how ancient and that's how huge and symbolic it is in the British parliamentary system and in British history. And so he frequented a lot of these sessions, and he would talk to MPs. What's interesting is that even before the Declaration of Independence was even an idea, he was already telling these members of Parliament that the colonies were never signed up to this idea of being taxed without representation. Now, I'm not sure if he said it that way, but he probably just cast a lot of doubts about what this would look like. In fact, he actually hinted at there would be some sort of conflict. I'm not sure how this went down with certain MPs. I think it depends on whether they were interested or not in terms of the colony's rights, or really just, I guess maybe some of them probably just laughed it off, saying, come on, it's never going to happen. But Stockton obviously had a big point, and hindsight is 2020, but nonetheless, Stockton was I think one of the first ones to bring about this idea and this problem that, hey, we've got this issue here with the colonies not wanting to be taxed without a representation. There should be an appetite to contribute to the war efforts that were going on during the French and Indian War. However, we can't go down this path of having these disputes. But none of this, unfortunately, came to fruition for him. Even though he was still able to travel again to Scotland and to other parts of the Great Britain, and to merely make a name for himself in a lot of these circles, and ultimately becoming a judge in the colony of New Jersey, things started to get worse, and there was more and more conflict. We've seen really over the last several episodes, really the entire series of some of those conflicts, how those brewed. And one could say that Stockton was a bit of a moderate. He was not, once again, just like a bit like John Hancock, for example. He was not just like, all of a sudden I want to go into the independence movement. It certainly wasn't like a Samuel Adams. But over time, he realized that his efforts were not working, and that he couldn't change people's minds over time. I don't think he was saying like, I'll just change this guy's mind by telling him that the colonies are not going to be taxed without representation. But the years and years of him trying to deliver this message just didn't work at all. And so he really had a choice. Do I want to be loyal to the king? Or do I want to be loyal to my country? And in this case, he decided to side with New Jersey, his colony, and really his country, which he considered his own neck of the woods in the British Empire. Even though he had all these royal duties lined up, he decided to leave those duties and to really pursue this representation of representing New Jersey at the Continental Congress. Now, Stockton was someone who was, again, very, very well respected on a lot of different measures. And he was selected to represent New Jersey at the Second Continental Congress, where they were going to debate about the Declaration. Unfortunately, there's always this thing called weather, and just like every single other person in the history of this world, no one can do anything about what Mother Nature does. And so it was a large storm, because obviously he probably could have used a weather app to time his travel there, but a huge storm delayed his arrival to the Second Continental Congress. You can imagine just how harsh those conditions were, especially with the rain coming down and the roads, because there's no asphalt, obviously, so traveling through those conditions was so tough. But he eventually made it, and it was kind of I would say, if I were to start, it'd be a bit of an awkward time to arrive, because John Adams just finished his speech on why the Declaration of Independence should be passed. And I mean, one could go along the better late than never sort of excuse, which I think most people probably would have taken that. But Stockton actually wanted to hear the speech, and so he actually asked John Adams to do the speech again about the Declaration of Independence, or I should say about the cause or the reasons to support independence. And Adams actually agreed, and so Adams gave a very, very fervent speech on the support for the Declaration of Independence, and Stockton was able to hear really the arguments from both sides, and in part probably because of Adams, he decided to vote in favor of independence. This is what he said about John Adams. He said, quote, "The Atlas of the hour, the man to whom the country is most indebted for the great measure of independency. He who sustained the debate and by the force of reasoning, demonstrated not only the justice, but the expediency of the measure, unquote. This is a really good couple sentences of Stockton describing Adams, really going to the theme of why Adams was such an influential figure. I always think that when it comes to debate on independence, no question George Washington played a huge role. But I do think there are times when we overlook John Adams as that orator, as that person who really in so many ways represented the independence movement all by himself. And there's a lot of people supported that, right? Jefferson and Hamilton and others. But Adams, I think because of the way that he came about through his career as, representing the British soldiers after the Boston Massacre, and going from that to now being a fervent supporter of independence, it's just something about Adams. And so Stockton really recognized that through that quote. And so he became the first signer from New Jersey to sign the Declaration of Independence and adopt it. And this is where the work really begins. Stockton was tasked, he was initially going to go back to being a judge, but he decided to stay in Congress. And one of the reasons why I think he stayed was because he very much cared about the well-being of the Continental Army. He didn't have, not that I know, but I don't think he had a lot of fighting experience, but he probably understood the importance of knowing how to be well equipped as an army. And he also cared about how those different kinds of elements, right, not having supplies and all that, how that could maybe affect the morale of the people fighting on behalf of the colonies. Stockton one time took a trip with another signer named George Clymer. They went to visit some troops in the north, and the northern part of of New York, to report on really what the state of these armies were like. And the reports were not great. The people were starving in a lot of ways. The uniforms were very much lacking or just not sufficient, especially for the cold. There were limited supplies on food, water, medicine. And he realized that Congress obviously had to step up to fund for those items. And this was a very, very tough time because Congress had a very limited amount to spend on. But he knew that he had to be there as a representative from the Congress and from his home colony, New Jersey. He had to be there to see for himself what was going on with these armies. I think this is one of the really, really big highlights of Stockton's career, is really that ability to have that compassion for his fellow countrymen. And it turns out he was one of the few signers that actually traveled with the Continental Army to some degree. For him to do this, I think it indicates very much how much he really got on board with that independence movement, but not just sitting around telling people, hey, I signed this amazing document. He's actually going out there and helping those to the best of his ability. Now, on the way back, on November 30th, 1776, while he was sleeping at night, unfortunately, the British had already breached into the colony of New Jersey, and in particular into his home of Morven. He was captured about 30 miles outside of Princeton, I believe, and he was literally dragged in his nightclothes by the British out of a friend's home, as Stockton basically had to evacuate his family and leave his beloved home of Morven. He was captured and taken to a notorious prison, and this prison was really, really harsh. He was there for almost 2 months, which, when you think about how almost more than 12,000 men died on prison ships and prisons in New York, compared to just somewhere around 4,400 battle casualties during the entire war, in that part of the colonies. I mean, that just blows your mind. And he was just absolutely tortured in these ridiculous prison conditions. It took 2 months. Remember, this is the end of November, so through December, through Christmas time, and through New Year's time, it was not an easy time. When we think about, if I were to pause here for a second, think about the title of this series, the Sacred Honor series. This comes from that last statement in the Declaration of Independence. We mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. When the British stormed his home of Morven and took his livestock, probably destroyed his crops, burned his precious library, you can't begin to imagine how risky that statement was, but also how that statement just represented for years after the signing the struggles that people have had throughout all those years during the American Revolution. Stockton was one of the quintessential examples of what was going to happen if you were to go against the monarch. And initially, when Stockton was going to be considered for parole, he was basically told by General William Howe that you could be let go. However, you could not participate in the war effort, which I guess at least in General Howe's mind, and really just from both sides of the aisle, that was kind of the middle ground, that you wouldn't. It wasn't that at least in that case, there were certain people who were certainly forced to try, to pledge allegiance to the king or to be forced to fight for the colonies. But the middle ground, which is almost barely middle ground here in this case, but the middle ground was that you wouldn't participate in that war effort. What is really shocking, though, is how someone like General Howe could even say that when Stockton was already feeling so ill and having been tortured for almost 2 months in one of the harshest winters that he could ever remember. He was given parole by General Howe. He was released, and I think in part because General Washington wrote a letter to General Howe to try and negotiate a release for him. Washington was very close friends with Stockton's wife as well, Annis Stockton, and Washington understood the value of Mr. Stockton and what he contributed to the war effort. And while Stockton was able to release, he was incredibly sick, and he almost died actually when he returned home. He was and not to mention that when he returned home, he saw his whole estate absolutely trashed by the British. I can't begin to imagine what that was like for Annis and his family. And what is fascinating is how Stockton's son-in-law was actually another signer named Dr. Benjamin Rush. And Dr. Rush really gave a lot of insight into the kinds of actions that the British took against Stockton, including the description of what the British were doing to his home. He regained his health. Stockton regained his health, and he returned to law practice. But because obviously he was not feeling great at all. But something even more sinister occurred. I think this could have been so much worse had it. I think if it were to happen nowadays, in terms of nowadays technology, this probably could have been a lot worse, given the times. When Stockton was released, there was a man named Mr. Cocker. He was a very pro George III, a Tory essentially, who lived in the area, and he decided to spread a rumor that Stockton was given parole because he pledged allegiance to the king, and that this is not one of these sort of middle grounds or scenarios or negotiations, but rather that there was assumed that Stockton, or the rumor assumed that Stockton decided to just pledge allegiance to the king and really try to save himself and save his own fortunes. And the rumor actually even included the name Richard Stockton in there. The issue, though, was not the name. It was the fact that name was a different Major Richard Stockton, who was the first cousin of the Stockton we've been talking about. Richard Witham Stockton was a commissioned officer in the British Army. So there was a real guy named him who was serving for the British, but the rumor was trying to confuse the original Stockton and this new guy. And I cannot believe that something like this could happen. But on the other hand, we're living in a world of politics here. And certainly, I feel like this example of this rumor that almost spread, but thank goodness that Dr. Rush and others clarify that this is not the same person, that the signer is not a loyalist. He still believes in the cause, but he's just trying to recover. And for this rumor to spread around, it's disgusting. I look at this example and I think a lot about what we've been discussing nowadays in politics about rumors, about misinformation and disinformation. There was misinformation and disinformation at that time too. The technology was very different. Certainly a lot of the different ideas. While there were certain common ideas, obviously, about the role of the United States and what the United States should be, there's still a lot of commonalities. But nonetheless, this is the kind of garbage that was going on in that time period. And thank goodness that there were people who were able to correct this, because his legacy and his reputation as someone who did try to do so much for the independence cause, not a perfect man by any means. I'm sure every single signer obviously has flaws just like everybody else, but to try to tarnish someone's reputation, that reminds you of something nowadays. Definitely let me know. But this is really a culmination of Stockton's career, because unfortunately his health did not recover. It actually got worse and he developed cancer. He, like several of the signers that we've either covered already or are going to cover in this series, did not live to actually see the United States become the United States. He died on February 28th, 1781. When he passed away, the president of the College of New Jersey was a man named Dr. Samuel Smith. I thought this was a very interesting quote that he decided to deliver about Richard Stockton's legacy. Quote, "If what honors this young country can bestow, if many and great personal talents could save man from the grave, behold here the end of all perfection, to have been a son of this college, and it was one of the first honors of this college to have given birth to such a son, a man who has long been foremost in his country for power, for wisdom, and for fortune. Another of the fathers of learning and eloquence is gone. In council he was wise and firm, but always prudent and moderate. The office of judge of the province was never filled with more integrity and learning than it was by him for several years before the Revolution. Since that period he hath represented New Jersey in the Congress of the United States, but a declining health and constitution worn out with application and with service obliged him shortly after to retire from the line of public duty, and hath at length dismissed him from the world." Unquote. Stockton represented a lot of the incredible qualities that we've seen with some of these signers. Once again, this is not a complete glorification of every single signer, but to see that people like Stockton actually lived out the final words of sacrificing their lives of fortunes and their sacred honor, that I think is what makes this Declaration of Independence not just as a profound document that time, but I think one of the most profound documents and stories throughout the history of the world. There's a statue of Richard Stockton by Henry Kirk Brown. It was actually dedicated to Congress in 1888, so more than 100 years after his passing. And it is actually placed in Statuary Hall in the Capitol Building in Washington, D.C. It's one of the statues in the National Statuary Collection. So if any of you go to Washington, D.C., you can go and find the statue of Richard Stockton, who is actually only one of only 6 signers to be honored in this way. His wife, Annis, outlived him by about 20 years. He was married to her for decades, and for Annis, she was actually one of America's first female published poets, which I found very interesting. Annis and Richard Stockton had 6 children. She was, again, a very close friend of George Washington, which I'm sure also very much benefited Richard Stockton's release as well. His grandson, Stockton's grandson, was named Robert F. Stockton, who was also a very prominent politician and member of the military. He was one of California's first senators. He was also a Navy Commodore, and he's also the namesake for those who live in Northern California, who previously lived in California, like myself. And he is the namesake of Stockton, California. There's also another gentleman named Elias Boudinot. A very interesting last name, but anyway, he was actually the brother-in-law of Richard Stockton. Boudinot served as president of Congress from 1782 to 1783. He was a former congressman from New Jersey and director of the Mint. Obviously, he outlived his brother-in-law, the main Stockton, whom we've been speaking about. On September 24th, 1789, the House of Representatives at the time voted to recommend the First Amendment of the newly drafted Constitution to the states for ratification. The very next day, Congressman Boudinot proposed that the House and Senate jointly request of President Washington to proclaim a day of thanksgiving for, quote, the many signal favors of Almighty God, unquote. This is something that I got from Wikipedia, just a very interesting fact here. And Boudinot said that he, quote, could not think of letting the session pass over without offering an opportunity to all the citizens of the United States of joining with one voice in returning to Almighty God their sincere thanks for the many blessings he had poured down upon them, unquote. This was actually the precursor to the establishment of Thanksgiving as a federal holiday, which I did not know about, but isn't this fascinating when you do an episode about Richard Stockton and you talk to someone's brother-in-law and you get to learn about something new regarding a federal holiday and a holiday that really represents so much of what America stands for? This is one of my favorite highlights there. So Elias Boudinot, someone who had a very interesting last name, but someone who had an even more interesting contribution to the Congress and to American history. I want to now wrap up, as usual, with some main takeaways that I think could really benefit all of you when it comes to how to engage in the politics, really based on the lessons of our signer the first signer from New Jersey, Richard Stockton. The first is, even the most dedicated public servants in all different capacities will be criticized and opposed. And so it's based on how someone conducts himself or herself that will define how someone is successful at entering and completing public service. I say that because in this example, obviously, with the rumor that was spread about Richard Stockton, hopefully, no public servant ever goes through what he went through in prison. That's for sure. However, I feel that there's a lot of people who go into politics, they think that they're not going to be criticized at all, that they don't need to hear another side, or that they're so likable that no one could possibly ever dislike them. And that's just not the case in politics. It's not the case when people have these different views, and sometimes you just don't know why or when someone doesn't like you. It's just the way it is. And I know that when it comes to the most popular figures, Washington, Lincoln, FDR, or Reagan, or Clinton, or whoever it is, there's always going to be opponents. There's always going to be people, just naysayers. And the most important thing when it comes to being involved in politics in any way whatsoever is to know that you will be criticized and opposed, but you don't have to give back a taste of their own medicine necessarily. You have to be aware of how you conduct yourself, be aware of the best way to approach it. If someone is saying really, really terrible things, I don't think it's necessarily the answer to just do the same thing, because what does that say about one's conduct? And so I just want to make that first point about how don't be afraid of that criticism. use constructive criticism when you can, when it comes to a debate in politics. Maybe you're talking about politics with a friend or with someone else. Don't be afraid of using criticism to help yourself and to boost your platform so that you can do better at debating your own views and to engage with others in the political process. The second thing is, I feel like when in politics, we need to prioritize engaging with others in personal manners and not through just simple modes of other technological forms of communication. The reason why I say that is because a lot of times, especially even in the limited number of internships that I've done, there were times when I couldn't relate to someone in that time because I never saw them in person. Certainly when I was doing a couple of those internships, this was around the time of the pandemic. However, I think one thing that we should learn from the pandemic and from really just politics in general is the importance of being there, like in person, talking with someone. This is really derived from that lesson of Richard Stockton going with the Continental Armies to see for himself the challenges. Would it really be the same feeling if Stockton just wrote a letter to the commanding officer and just said, okay, tell me all the problems. Just list all the problems to me and just send them to me in a letter. Wouldn't that be the same feeling? Of course not. So for him to go, and obviously this is so risky because of what happened later on. However, this, I think, was a very critical lesson because we just feels like we don't engage with others in personal ways as much or of the same quality anymore. Nowadays, when we see what happens with technology, when people abuse it or simply just use it for the wrong reasons, we don't get optimal results. That's why I'm not surprised when people are just too lazy to go out and actually try to make change or trying to make some sort of positive effect on the community when they haven't even been outside, when they haven't even met the people around them or asked them or try to engage in conversation. That's what we need to do more. If we want to be leaders, if we want to engage more in the political process, we have to start listening and start engaging with those people, but not to do it through Facebook or through an email. Do it in person. So I highly encourage that people do take that route when they get into the political process. And the final thing is, even when there's all this politics and all this crazy stuff that's happening, always find something or someone you are grateful for. I think about Mr. Boudinot's contribution, the brother-in-law of Richard Stockton, even though Richard Stockton had virtually nothing to do with this. But I love that a message that he gave about the importance of sincere thanks for the blessings. There's so many times when people are, I understand they're complaining about all kinds of issues, but there comes a point in time, maybe when it's off camera, maybe when it's people who are out of session, right, out of like a legislative session, there needs to be time and space for people to be grateful for something. There are people who are complaining about, for example, one of the things that I've been seeing is people complaining about the student loans as an example. Think about how there are different parts of the world nowadays, including in a place called Ukraine, where people don't have time to be thinking about these kinds of things. As much as we can be passionate about an issue, shouldn't we at least consider the context of that issue rather than just the issue itself? I think the gratitude element is going to, at the very minimum, it doesn't necessarily diminish an issue, but it does give some reassurance that there's still a lot of things to look forward to. That outside of politics or within politics, there are alliances, there are ways for people to get to know one another and to just not have to even talk about politics even at certain times. So finding something that you are grateful for every time, I think that's what is going to make engaging in whatever political process you want to go into, it'll make it just that much better and maybe a little less stressful for sure. Those are some of my takeaways, and I just want to say thank you all so much for listening to this episode about Richard Stockton, the first signer from the colony of New Jersey. Once again, if you haven't subscribed, make sure to do so to get latest notifications about new content when it comes out. Enjoy the rest of your day, the rest of your week, the rest of your month. And I will see you all next time remember, a day in America is always better when we are with our friends and fellow citizens.